Have you ever walked into a room where everyone already decided you were the villain and you had to just sit there and let them finish? I did that. For 11 minutes, I counted the ceiling tiles in Conference Room B of the Hartwell Building in Atlanta, while my stepmother told a room full of people I was too emotionally unstable to manage my own father's company. I counted 32 tiles. I remember thinking that was an odd number for a rectangular room. I did not cry. I did not interrupt. I folded my hands on the table in front of me and I let her talk. That was the plan. My father, Gerald Calloway, built Calloway Property Group from a single rental unit in Decatur to a mid-size real estate firm managing over 40 commercial properties across Georgia and South Carolina. He did it over 26 years with a yellow legal pad, a handshake philosophy, and a stubbornness that I inherited completely. He used to say the only thing harder to move than a bad tenant was a Calloway who had made up their mind. I think about that a lot now. He married my stepmother, Sandra, when I was 14. I want to be careful here because for a long time, I genuinely tried to give her credit. She was not cruel to me in any obvious way. She was just always slightly sideways, the way a door hangs when the frame has shifted. Nothing you could point to, nothing you could name. Just the constant small sensation that the house had changed shape and nobody else noticed. Her son, Derek, was 17 when they married. He had his mother's eyes and none of my father's patience, and he spent the next decade bouncing between half-finished business ventures while my father quietly wrote checks and said nothing critical out loud. Derek called him Dad. My father let him. I watched all of this from a careful distance and said nothing either. I went to Georgia State for accounting, then got my CPA, then spent 4 years at a firm in Buckhead doing forensic audit work before my father asked me to come in-house. He was 61 by then. His handwriting had started to change. His doctor was using words like progression and management plan in the same sentence, and my father had started waking up at 3 a.m. to write things down so he would not forget them by breakfast. I moved back to Atlanta in March of that year. By November, I was CFO. By the following September, my father was gone. The will was clean. Our estate attorney, a methodical woman named Priscilla Okafor, who had worked with my father for 16 years, had helped him revise it 8 months before he died. The Calloway Property Group went to me. The house in Druid Hills went to Sandra with a life estate, meaning she could live there as long as she wanted, but could not sell it without my approval. There were accounts left to Derek totaling just under $200,000. It was fair. It was organized. My father had thought about it very carefully. Sandra did not think it was fair. I know this because she told me. Not directly. Not at first. She told me through Derek, who called me 3 days after the funeral to explain that my father had not been in his right mind when he updated the will and that a judge would probably agree once they looked at the medical records. He said this in the tone of someone explaining a parking validation policy. Matter of fact, almost bored. I said, "Okay, Derek, I'll keep that in mind." And then I hung up and I sat in my father's office in the building on Peachtree Road and I looked at the wall for a long time. Here is what I knew that they did not know I knew. My father had been meticulous about documentation his entire life. Every meeting had minutes. Every phone call had a follow-up email. Every decision had a paper trail that stretched back to the original conversation. When I came in as CFO, I inherited not just the financials, but the entire archive. 26 years of folders, both digital and physical, organized by year and then by category, and then alphabetically within each category. My father had once fired an assistant for misfiling a lease amendment under the wrong property code. I was his daughter. I had grown up watching him build that system, and I had spent 4 years doing forensic accounting, which means my entire professional skill set is finding the things someone does not want you to find. So when Derek called me to explain that my father had not been of sound mind, my first thought was not panic. My first thought was, that claim is going to require documentation. And documentation leaves traces. And traces are what I do. I did not call a lawyer that day. I did not call anyone. I went home, I made coffee, and I opened my laptop. The first irregularity I found was small. A consulting invoice from a firm called Meridian Advisory Group, billed to the company's operating account 4 months before my father died, for $38,000. The service description said Strategic Transition Planning. I had never heard of Meridian Advisory Group. I searched the Georgia Secretary of State's business registry. The company had been registered 11 months earlier. The registered agent was Derek Calloway. I closed the laptop. I went for a run. I came back and I opened it again. Over the next 8 weeks, I found 9 more invoices from companies I could not verify. 3 of them had Derek's address or his former business partner's address as the registered agent. 2 of them had been incorporated after the dates on the invoices, which is a thing that should be technically impossible, and yet there they were. Total amount billed to Callaway Property Group across all of them, just under $312,000. My father's signature was on every approval form. I pulled his signature from every document we had on file going back 5 years. I lined them up. I am not a handwriting expert, but I am someone who has spent years looking at financial documents for inconsistencies, and when you look at 200 examples of a person's signature, and then look at a set of 11, you start to see it. The pen pressure was wrong. The way he crossed the second L in Callaway was different. His signature had always had a slight rightward lean that these did not have. I did not tell Sandra. I did not tell Derek. I continued going to work every day, sitting in my father's chair, running his company, depositing their fraudulent invoices into a folder on an encrypted external drive that I kept in a lockbox at my apartment. I want to explain why I waited, because people always ask that. Why did you let it continue? Why didn't you go to the police immediately? The answer is that evidence degrades. People delete emails and shred documents and change stories the moment they know someone is watching. If I had confronted them in week 2, they would have lawyered up, shifted the paper trail, and I would have had 11 invoices and a theory. What I needed was the full picture. I needed to understand what they were building, not just what they had already taken. What they were building, I found out in month 3, was a competency challenge. I came across it by accident. Derek had CC'd the wrong email address on a message he meant to reach his attorney, but he had an old address for me and a new address for someone else on his contacts list, and the old address was still mine. The email was brief. It referenced something called the Callaway evaluation and said the appointment had been confirmed for the 14th and that everything needed to be in order before they filed. I read it 4 times. Then I forwarded it to myself, deleted it from his sent items through the shared company account he had carelessly left himself logged into on one of the office computers, and I went back to work. The Callaway evaluation turned out to be a psychiatric assessment, or rather, a document purporting to be one. They had found a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Fellers, who had an active license in Georgia and a practice in Alpharetta, and somehow arranged for him to produce a written evaluation, concluding that I displayed signs of complicated grief disorder, impaired executive function, and emotional dysregulation, making me unfit to manage the company's assets. I know this because Priscilla Okafor called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me that Sandra and Derek had filed a petition for a conservatorship hearing and that the petition included a psychiatric evaluation signed by Dr. Raymond Fellers dated the 14th. Have you ever seen this, Dr. Fellers? Priscilla asked. No, I said. I've never heard that name in my life. There was a pause on her end. Megan, she said carefully, if that's true, then this evaluation is fraudulent on its face. I know, I said. I've been waiting for this. I heard her exhale slowly. How long have you been waiting? About 3 months. Another pause. Tell me everything. I told her everything. I sent her the external drive contents. I gave her the email chain, the invoice analysis, the signature comparisons. I told her about Meridian Advisory Group and the 8 other shell companies and the $312,000. I told her I had also, very quietly, requested the security footage from our office building for every day in the 4 months before my father died, and that I had cross-referenced it with the approval dates on the fraudulent invoices, and that on 7 of those dates, Derek's car was not in the parking structure, and my father had no record of a meeting scheduled. Priscilla was quiet for a long moment. Your father raised you well, she said finally. I know, I said. I miss him every day. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the Fulton County Courthouse. Sandra had hired a downtown firm, 2 attorneys who wore good suits and carried the particular confidence of people accustomed to winning on paperweight alone. Derek sat beside his mother in a gray blazer that still had the crease lines from being unfolded that morning. He looked like a man who had already spent the settlement. I wore the dark blue dress I had worn to my father's memorial service. I brought a leather portfolio and a bottle of water, and I sat down at the respondent's table, and I folded my hands, and I counted the acoustic tiles in the ceiling. 31. Also an odd number. Sandra's attorney opened with the framing. Grief-stricken daughter, over her head, making impulsive financial decisions, showing erratic behavior in front of staff. He painted a picture of a company in disarray under my management. He cited 3 vendor contracts I had renegotiated as evidence of instability. He submitted Dr. Fellers' evaluation into the record. The judge, the Honorable Carl Whitmore, was 60-something with wire-rimmed glasses and the measured energy of a man who had heard every version of every story and retained his skepticism as a professional tool. He read the evaluation without expression. Sandra testified. She talked about my father's wishes. She talked about how worried he had been about me, how he had confided in her that I was struggling, how he had wanted to make sure the company was protected. She cried twice. The second time, Derek put his hand on her arm. I watched all of it. I kept my face neutral. Priscilla had told me, "Do not react. Do not look contemptuous. Do not give them a single frame they can use. Let them finish building the house before you show them the foundation is wrong." Then it was our turn. Priscilla stood up and said, "Your Honor, before we address the merits of this petition, we'd like to raise a threshold issue regarding the psychiatric evaluation submitted as Exhibit C." Judge Whitmore looked at her over his glasses. "Specifically," she said, "we'd like to establish when and where Dr. Fellers conducted his examination of Miss Calloway." Sandra's attorney objected on procedural grounds. Judge Whitmore overruled him with a small hand gesture that suggested he had heard that objection before and found it equally unpersuasive then. Dr. Fellers was present in the courtroom, which I had counted on. Priscilla had requested his appearance the week before, citing standard practice for expert witnesses submitting evaluations in competency proceedings. He was a compact man in his late 50s with a careful manner that I suspected had served him well in a legitimate practice before whatever arrangement he had made with Derek. Priscilla approached him with the measured pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they do not need to be. "Dr. Fellers," she said, "your evaluation indicates that you conducted a clinical interview with Megan Calloway on March 14th of this year. Is that correct?" "That's correct," he said. "Can you describe that interview? Where it took place? How long it lasted?" He described an office visit. 45 minutes. Standard intake questions. Observations of affect and cognition. Priscilla nodded slowly. "And you're confident about the date? March 14th? "Yes." She turned to the table and picked up a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit what we're marking as Respondent's Exhibit 1. She handed copies to the clerk, to Sandra's attorneys, to the judge. This is a certified record of keycard access to the Calloway Property Group offices at 811 Peachtree Street for the month of March. The highlighted entry shows that Megan Calloway badged into the building at 7:52 in the morning on March 14th and badged out at 8:44 in the evening. She was in that building for 13 hours. She let that sit for a moment. We're also submitting Respondent's Exhibit 2, which is a calendar export from Miss Calloway's company account showing 6 internal meetings, 2 client calls, and a property walkthrough on March 14th, all with timestamps and attendee confirmations. She set it down. And Respondent's Exhibit 3, which is security footage, time-stamped, continuous, unedited, showing Miss Calloway in the 4th floor conference room from 2:15 to 4:40 that afternoon. She turned back to Dr. Fellers. "Doctor," she said, "given that evidence, I'd like to ask again. Where exactly did you conduct your clinical interview with my client on March 14th? The room was very quiet. Dr. Fellers looked at Sandra's table. Just for a second, just long enough. Judge Whitmore took off his glasses. He set them down on the bench in front of him with a small, deliberate click, and he looked at Dr. Fellers the way you look at something you cannot quite believe you are seeing. "Dr. Fellers," he said, in a voice with no warmth in it at all, "I want you to think very carefully before you answer counsel's question." Dr. Fellers' jaw tightened. He said nothing. "Because what I'm looking at," Judge Whitmore continued, "is an evaluation entered into my court as a sworn exhibit claiming a clinical examination that the evidence now suggests did not occur. And I want to be certain I'm understanding this correctly before I decide what happens next." Sandra's senior attorney stood up. "Your Honor, perhaps we could." "Sit down," Judge Whitmore said. He sat down. The judge looked at Dr. Fellers for another long moment. Then he looked at Priscilla. "Counsel, I assume you have more." "We do, Your Honor," she said. "Quite a bit more." What followed took the better part of 2 hours. Priscilla walked through every fraudulent invoice. She presented the signature analysis, which she had commissioned from an actual forensic document examiner whose credentials took 4 minutes to read into the record. She presented the incorporation dates of the shell companies against the invoice dates, the registered agent addresses, the email chain Derek had accidentally sent to my old address. Derek's attorney objected 11 times. Judge Whitmore sustained 2 of them and overruled the other 9 with increasing brevity. Sandra stopped crying somewhere around the 3rd invoice presentation. I watched her face close the way a window closes quick, and then shut. Derek had gone very still beside her. He was staring at the table. At one point, Priscilla said, "Your Honor, we'd like to draw the court's attention to a company called Hargrove Consulting, which billed Callaway Property Group $44,000 in January for, quote, operational restructuring analyses, and which was incorporated on February 3rd, approximately 5 weeks after the invoice date." Judge Whitmore put his glasses back on. He looked at the document. He looked at Derek. Derek did not look back. "Miss Okafor," the judge said, "has this matter been referred to law enforcement?" "We filed a report with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office yesterday morning, Your Honor," Priscilla said. "We wanted to ensure the court had the opportunity to review the full scope of the matter before any parallel proceedings began." He nodded slowly. "That was thoughtful of you." He denied the conservatorship petition in full. He did it in 3 sentences, none of which were gentle. He noted for the record that the evaluation submitted as Exhibit C had been produced without the subject's knowledge or participation, and that submitting such a document as sworn evidence in a legal proceeding raised serious questions. That he was formally referring to the state bar and to the Georgia Composite Medical Board. Dr. Fellers left the room quickly. I watched him go, and I felt nothing in particular, which surprised me. Sandra stood very slowly, like someone whose joints had aged 10 years in one morning. Derek said something low to his attorney. His attorney shook his head. I stayed seated until almost everyone had filed out. Priscilla gathered her documents with the calm efficiency of someone who had expected exactly this and felt no need to celebrate it in public. When she was done, she looked at me and gave a small nod, the kind that means, "We did what we came to do." In the hallway outside, one of Derek's attorneys walked past me without making eye contact. The other one, the younger one, glanced at me for just a moment. I could not read what was in his face. Maybe the first edges of a lesson. I want to be honest about what came after because the story does not end cleanly the way people sometimes want it to. The district attorney's office opened an investigation. That is not the same as an indictment, and an indictment is not the same as a conviction, and I have learned not to set my watch by any of it. What I know as of now is that the process is moving, that Priscilla is involved, and that Derek has retained a criminal defense attorney, which tells me something. Dr. Fellers surrendered his license voluntarily 4 weeks after the hearing, before the medical board completed its review. I learned this from a 2-paragraph notice in a professional licensing database I check occasionally. I do not know what arrangement he made or what he was told. I know he is no longer practicing. The shell company funds the $312,000 are the subject of a civil action that Priscilla filed the same week as the DA referral. Sandra's personal accounts were frozen pending the outcome. She is still living in the Druid Hills house because the life estate is valid, and I am not interested in making a grieving woman homeless. I am interested in recovering my father's money and in making sure the record reflects what happened. Those are different goals. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry. I think about that question a lot. I was angry in November, the night Derek called me to suggest my father had not been in his right mind. I was angry in February, the night I cross-referenced the shell company dates and understood fully what I was looking at. I was angry the morning I found Dr. Fellers' name on a sworn evaluation for an examination that never happened, because that particular piece of it, using the language of medicine as a weapon against someone's credibility, felt like a violation that went beyond money. But by the time I sat down in that conference chair and started counting ceiling tiles, the anger had done its job and finished. Anger is fuel, not a destination. My father taught me that too, not in words, but in the way he operated, which was always to gather more information before he moved. I run Callaway Property Group now. I renegotiated those 3 vendor contracts that Sandra's attorney cited as evidence of instability, and the revised terms saved the company about $60,000 annually, which is the kind of return that makes the word instability difficult to use with a straight face. I hired 2 new property managers in the spring. I am looking at an acquisition in Savannah that I think my father would have liked. I go to his grave on the first Sunday of every month. I bring coffee. He never wanted flowers. He wanted coffee, and I sit there for a while and I talk to him. I tell him about the company, about the cases, about the Savannah property. I tell him that his systems work, that his files are still organized exactly the way he left them, that I have not misfiled a single amendment. I tell him I am okay. Most of the time when I say it, it is true. One more thing. The day after the hearing, I came back to the office. I sat down at my desk. I opened the current month's financials and I began reviewing them the way I review them every month, line by line, vendor by vendor, looking for the thing that does not fit. Not because I expected to find anything, because that is what you do when something is yours and you intend to keep it. My father used to say that the only thing harder to move than a bad tenant was a Callaway who had made up their mind. I have made up my mind.